Well, thanks so much to the department for having this event. I'm really pleased that it's happening, even though it's too bad it has to be in this remote way. I'll just say briefly, I fully agree with what Deb Tollefson said about John. He was indeed a quiet philosophical genius. I thought that from the first month or so when he first showed up in Memphis and I first got to know him. I remember how over the top some of his recommendation letters were. Hard to believe, but I quickly realized that those letters were not exaggerating. In the handout, I've got a lot of material that I used for a talk at the APA Eastern this past January, where I was discussing various themes and issues involving work that I'd done collaboratively with John, sometimes with George Graham as well, the three of us, and also work that's been directly influenced by that is ongoing work by me, often collaborative as well, some with David Henderson in epistemology, for example, and our Slovene colleagues, Matjaž Poterč and Vojko Strahovnik, ongoing work with Mark Timmons in metaethics and moral phenomenology. Key ideas in all this work originated from John, really. So I've got a lot of material about that lower on the handout, and also some bibliographical references. But I don't really want to talk about that. I put it on the handout, but in this brief amount of time, I want to talk more briefly about some aspects of John's work to kind of quickly zero in and get a sense of what his philosophical mind was like. Now, I have a short list of my favorite philosophy papers, a handful of them. What would they be? Rudolf Carnap, Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology. Brian McLaughlin, The Rise and Fall of British Emergentism. David Lewis, Scorekeeping in the Language Game. Daniel Dennett, Where Am I? And John Tienson, A Conception of Metaphysics. That's my handful of favorite philosophy papers. John's paper was published in the American Philosophical Quarterly in January of 1989. I want to zero in on some key themes in this paper to get a sense of how his philosophical mind worked. So I've got some quotations on the handout that come from early in the paper. Quoting from John. In the introduction to Individuals, the book by P.F. Strawson, Strawson distinguishes between descriptive metaphysics and revisionary metaphysics. David, your screen went blank for me, but I'll keep reading anyway. As he makes the distinction, quote, John now quoting P.F. Strawson, descriptive metaphysics is content, sorry, I lost my place here. Is content to describe the structure of our actual thought about the world. Revisionary metaphysics is concerned to produce a better structure, end of quote. He gives us Descartes, Leibniz, and Berkeley as examples of revisionary metaphysicians. Kant and Aristotle are descriptive metaphysicians. All of this is quoting John now. Strawson's characterization of revisionary metaphysics is, I believe, misleading at best. To the extent that Descartes, Leibniz, or Berkeley thought he was producing a better structure, the main virtue he thought his virtue had was its truth. As they saw it, they were attempting to describe the world as it really is. So I think we should characterize their side of the distinction as real metaphysics, focusing on their intent without prejudging the possibility of success. Real metaphysics attempts to describe the actual fundamental structure of the world. I believe that both real and descriptive metaphysics are necessary. There is a world, and our thought about it is but part of that world. Any complete philosophical position must tell a story about the structure of our thought, a story about the wider world of which that thought is a part, and a story about how the two are related. I'll set out and explain a simple pattern of questions that I think must be answered in telling these stories. I'm continuing to quote John. In fact, most of what I'm going to be doing for a while here is quoting John. because I think it's a good way to get ourselves quickly into how he thought about things. Quoting, "I believe real metaphysics is best thought of in terms of two questions. One, what kinds of objective facts are there? Two, what is the ontological analysis of those facts? The nitty-gritty of Strawson's descriptive metaphysics is analysis of our particular judgments or concepts. So that's question 0. What is the analysis of our judgments of kind X? Question 0 is to be taken as a question about the content of our judgments on their own terms, so to speak. That is, from the perspective of our ordinary conceptual scheme. Perhaps the question can be put like this: what would the world be like? What kinds of objective entities and facts would there be if there were objective facts of the kind that our judgments say there are? We cannot assume that there are objective facts corresponding to every judgment that we make. Consider the distinction between primary and secondary qualities. This distinction can be understood in a way that makes shapes and sizes objective, but denies objectivity to colors and tastes. Thus, there's a particularly significant special case of question 1 prime. Concerning judgments of kind X, are there objective facts of that kind? For example, objective facts about colors and tastes. If a philosopher concludes that there are no objective facts of the sort that a certain kind of judgment says there are, a further important question arises. What are the objective conditions under which it is correct to make judgments of that kind? Even a position which denies objective facts of a certain kind must recognize that there are objective conditions under which it is correct to say that there are such things, and objective conditions under which it's not correct. It's important not to confuse question 0 with question 3. And I think John thought that confusing those two questions was a rather pervasive thing, especially in recent analytic philosophy. Back to the text. Question 0 asks how our judgments say the world is. Question 3 asks how it is with the world when we make judgments that we recognize as correct. The answers need not be the same, and the answer to one has no direct implications concerning the other. So that's all I have on the handout from this paper, but now I want to pursue what he was thinking some more to get a feel for how John Tienson thought about philosophy. So I'm going to mostly be quoting here from section 3 now. He says, suppose the philosophical position says there are no objective facts corresponding to a given kind of judgment. What should we say about the truth of those judgments? The natural and I believe correct thing to say is that on that view, all such judgments are false. So it's correct to say of certain things that they are red, but it's false. There's a footnote here to that paragraph, and I want to jump to the footnote. He says, the view in question, that is a certain kind of general philosophical view which addresses both question 0 and question 3, taken as a whole, may include a view of truth. In other words, what is the real ontological nature of truth, right? A view of truth not as correspondence, but as coherence of some kind, or some kind of proper, as coherence or as some kind of proper assertability. In that case, the view as a whole may say that many ordinary judgments are true. I think, however, that the natural common sense view of truth, the default view, so to speak, is a kind of correspondence view, which makes it reasonable and proper to say that certain of our ordinary judgments are systematically false. Now, John and I don't think we quite saw eye to eye about matters like this. This is one way that I've been heavily influenced by the contextualist thought of David Lewis. That's one reason why another of my favorite philosophy papers is Lewis's paper, Scorekeeping in the Language Game. I'm more inclined to go contextualist about the actual uses and thus the actual meaning of various of our key concepts, including our concept of truth. But I'm still very broadly in sympathy with the sort of thing that John was doing for all that. Okay, I want to now pursue a bit more how he thinks this way of thinking about things makes a real difference. So I'm going to go back and now quote some more from section 3 of his paper. Consider, for example, a position which distinguishes between primary and secondary qualities, and which says something like the following about secondary qualities. When we judge perceptually or otherwise that some object is red, we attribute to it a certain simple, non-relational, immediately perceivable quality distributed over its surface. So that's what you'd say if you're analyzing the content of the judgment. But according to this view, physical objects do not have the simple, non-relational, immediately perceivable qualities that they appear to have. They have complex structures which give them the capacity to produce experiences of seeing colors, and we correctly say that an object is red if it would normally produce the experience of seeing a shade of red in normal circumstances, or the like. So according to this view, there are certain objective circumstances under which it is correct to judge that an object is red. Correct to judge. But objects do not have anything of the sort that we judge them to have when we make these judgments. So they're correct, but they're false, right? Correct, but nevertheless false. You know, that's not the way people usually think about things in analytic philosophy. That's how John thought we should think about them. Now I want to quote a bit from this paper where he does some historical work. His favorite philosopher was Hume. Okay, quoting John again. Hume is as much subject to varying interpretations of the overall intent and import of his work as any major philosopher. He's also the only avowed skeptic among major philosophers. These are not unrelated facts. Hume's method involved just the interplay of descriptive and real metaphysics that I've been talking about. And both this method and his skepticism are easily understandable in our terms. On each central philosophical topic in the treatise, Hume asks what our ordinary judgments require for their truth. That's question 0. Then he asks what relevant objective facts there are. That's question 1 prime. And he argues, often subtly and differently in each case, either A, that there are no objective facts of the kind our judgments require, or B, that we have no reason to believe that there are such objective facts. Hence, our ordinary judgments are either, in case A, false, or B, unjustified. Finally, on each topic, he asks a question akin to our question 3, the one which asks about the objective conditions for making ordinary judgments. In his terms, the question is, what are the causes of belief? An answer to this question will tell us, inter alia, the objective features of our experience under which we believe these ordinary things. And he intends this to be understood so that it's quite proper, although false, for us to have these beliefs in these objective circumstances. For our having these beliefs in these circumstances is determined by universal principles of human nature. Treatise 1:4:4. Okay, how about an example? Continuing quoting from John. Take, for example, the identity of ordinary changeable objects. For this to be the same tree as was there last month, Hume says, common sense requires at least that there be some one entity that is there continuously from then until now. But in fact, there is no such entity. We want to say it is the tree. But what existing entity can the tree be? It's not the same collection of matter, for there has been both gain and loss of material through metabolism. He's citing page 255, the treatise. Cannot be the collection of properties, its size, shape, and color have changed. page 257. And for the same reason, it does not present the same appearances. So our ordinary judgment of identity is false. It is a grammatical fiction, Hume says. It's important to appreciate the ontological nature of Hume's thinking here. Hume then goes on to consider the conditions under which we judge that something is the same after time and change. We do so, he says, when the changes are gradual, proportionally small, or conspire in service of a goal, when there's a causal interdependence of parts, and sometimes when the changes are familiar. Under these conditions, it is correct for us to say that it is the same thing. That's question 3, right? Although it's not literally true. It's important that Hume's argument is an internal argument. It goes, common sense requires something for identity over time. But when we examine what common sense says is actually present in cases where we say something is the same, we do not find what common sense requires. The judgments of common sense are false by the light of common sense. Well, I think that's pretty striking, and it's striking the extent to which you don't encounter that approach to things very much in standard analytic philosophy. I think maybe enough to give a flavor for the distinctness and quality of John's thought, including his appreciation for the history of philosophy and his determination to take the ideas of the historical figures on their own terms and not try to impose a hermeneutic overlay in terms of the categories and ways of thinking that are common in 20th century analytic philosophy. Okay, well, on the handout, I'll just mention some of the topics, and then I'll say something quickly about things that were done. Connectionism and the philosophy of psychology. John and I worked quite actively on connectionism and the philosophy of psychology. The connectionist movement arose quickly and prominently in the mid-1980s. And John and I were in an interdisciplinary cognitive science group at the University of Memphis. We had a number of the main figures come in and discuss these new ideas with them in an interdisciplinary setting. John and I ran a Spindell conference on connectionism and the philosophy of mind, which was the first philosophical conference on this topic. We thought there were some quite important and philosophically significant ideas to be gleaned from the connectionist movement and from certain recalcitrant problems in ongoing cognitive science and its foundations that suggest that a new approach was needed. In a nutshell, we thought there's reason to think that human cognition is too subtle to be computation, contrary to the dominant view in cognitive science that it is a form of computation. And the reasons had to do with the extent to which human cognition is quite typically very holistic in its operation. You have to draw on massive amounts of background knowledge and massive understanding in ways that often involve appreciating how these considerations come together holistically in their import. More on that in the paper that I'm going to give next, which was co-written with John, and most of the ideas in that paper come directly from John. The second topic I've got on the handout here, massive modularity and the frame problem. The frame problem in cognitive science is the problem that we were stressing. Jerry Fodor had also long stressed it in his work. The problems that the holism of rational cognition makes for thinking about cognition in computational terms. Massive modularity is a way of trying to get around it. Fodor thought it was pretty hopeless. John and I thought so too. Phenomenal intentionality. Well, there's going to be a lot about that in this conference. There's going to be a lot about that in the paper that I'll give next. various people in the analytic tradition, it often almost simultaneously, and in some cases, some largely or entirely independently, found themselves thinking about intentionality and philosophy of mind in ways that were quite different from the received thinking in analytic philosophy. And that happened to me very directly under the influence of conversations with John. I started with a much more received wisdom kind of way of thinking about the relevant issues. And I know that my change of heart came quite directly by influence from John Tienson. Morphological content and chromatic illumination, epistemological applications. Morphological content is an idea that John and I urged in our work on connectionism. The basic thought here was that much of what goes on in cognition that accommodates appreciation of background knowledge and information happens and must happen without the relevant background information coming to be overtly represented in experience, but rather that information is in some sense automatically accommodated in cognition and is automatically accommodated by virtue of the standing structure of the cognitive system, the morphology. So we came to call it morphological content. And the idea of morphological content has been very persistent in a lot of work that I've done since then. Epistemological work with David Henderson, and now with David Henderson and my Slovene colleagues, Matjaž Poturč and Vojko Strahovnik. Ongoing work concerning moral phenomenology and its relevance to metaethics with my colleague Mark Timmons, who used to be at Memphis when I was in Memphis. So was David. We were all there, John, Mark, David, and I. Yeah, it was a real Camelot kind of place. Yeah, so that's just a quick running over of themes, past and present, that have been very important in my own thinking and in the thinking of my collaborators jointly with me. And all of it is part of the legacy of John Tienson. And so I've got some pertinent texts citing a lot of this work. Okay, John Tienson, his philosophy and his legacy. Miss him dearly.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Horgan. Why don't we take a 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene here in just a second. And if you send me that handout, I'll make sure to put it up.